Here we go. If you would open your Bibles, please, to James chapter 1. James chapter 1. We're going to be looking at verses 2 through 4 this morning as we continue into our text, just beginning last week with an introduction and now this. So James chapter 1, looking at verses 2 through 4. There's a poem that called The Weaver that they share actually in our bereavement program that we have at church, Grief Share, that one of the counselors, individuals was talking about recently, and I thought, it's perfectly fitting here, and I'd like to share it with you. I think it's actually fairly well known, although I've seen it attributed, one, like anonymous, like nobody's really sure who wrote it, other times to B.M. Franklin. I don't know who that is, but I'm not sure, but I'd like to read that to you now, and it says this: "My life is but a weaving between my God and me. I do not choose the colors, he worketh steadily. Oft times he weaveth sorrow, and I in foolish pride forget he sees the upper, and I the underside. Not till the loom is silent, and the shuttles cease to fly, will God unroll the canvas and explain the reason why. The dark threads are as needful in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he has planned." There's an attempt there in that poem to try to explain at some level why life happens the way that it does. And it begs the question a little bit, are those dark threads needed? And in light of the poem and everything that we know, we would have to answer, well, yes. Are those dark threads wanted? That's a totally different question. And of course, by default, our answer is, well, no. I don't want them. And yet they remain. And for many of us, they defy logical reasons of why they exist. And we struggle underneath them to find a purpose as we look from underneath. Why are these things here? And there are those that try to explain some of those things away, like why do we suffer and struggle the way we do in life? And there are simply some that says it's the result of a meaningless, purposeless life. It's just simply that we're existing randomly in the universe and the world around us, and we should not be surprised when bad things happen to us because it's all meaningless. Everything that we know and everything that we have is simply meaningless, and we should not be surprised by suffering. There are also those who, more in the light of a Buddhist kind of a mentality, have done things and they would just simply define life is suffering by default. And the only way to remedy that reality is to kind of detach yourself from desire. Because if you don't want anything, then you won't actually suffer. And they try to do that. They try to detach themselves from life. They try to detach themselves from the things that they desperately want, which aren't necessarily in and of themselves bad things. But they separate themselves from the relationships they have in their family. They separate themselves from life goals. They separate themselves from work and from wealth and from everything else, materialism. Because if I don't actually want it, I'll never suffer if I have it or if it's taken away from me. And so they remove that from themselves. The problem is, by default, when you do that, you also take away joy, love, value, all the other things that we appreciate that make life what it is. You basically are numb. The Bible, thankfully, takes a very different approach. And rather than saying that suffering and trial in life is meaningless, James is going to say it's purposeful. But how? How can he say that? And we're going to look a little bit this morning at how he can actually say that. And it's hard for us, though, to wrap our minds around, because how can tragedy and pain and suffering be considered profitable? Especially when it comes from the hand of someone who at least claims on the surface to love us. And yet that's exactly what James says. And it is a great question. And I certainly do not claim to have every nuance of answer that you will want. And James is not actually going to offer us every nuance of an answer that we want. And in fact, as I enter these waters, I am extremely hesitant because I know what's going on in your backgrounds. I know I'm not tone deaf to what's going on in our church family, recently and even in the past year and a half. Like, I know what's going on here. And honestly, reading some of this is going to feel like God is just putting salt in all of our wounds and saying, yeah, this is good for you. Or like, how is this good? It hurts too much. I understand that. The problem is we still have to enter into these waters. Because there is never going to be a time in life when tragedy and trial stop coming at us, and we need to know how to handle it. We need to know how to approach it and try to understand them. And so now, unfortunately, is as good a time as any. The joyful perseverance in trials is going to lead Christians, lead you to a place of maturity in the Christian life and in God that cannot be gotten or not be had in any other way. That's the long and the short of it. And I know that defies logic and reason, and we're all going to sit there and go, no, there must be some other way. And James is going to tell us there's not. There's just not. And so this is hard for us. And I will say, too, that as you sometimes come across someone who is in the midst of a trial or suffering and doing this, this is not your go-to verse. As they're just entering into something that says, hey, consider it all joy when you face trials. Put a smile on. If they hit you, you deserve it. That's not where you go. This is not where you go. The Bible talks about weep with those who weep. So weep with them. Give them a hug and walk through this with them. This is for later. And it probably, if you're even wondering, should I say this to them? The answer is probably no. You're not close enough to them to say this to them yet. Let God do the work in their lives. This is not something that you start with. This is for, as the trial continues and progress goes, this is the perspective that needs to be had, but not in the beginning. Weep with those who weep. But let's read now these verses, just 2, 3, and 4. We'll read them together, even though we'll cite some of them again later on. But he says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Considering the fabric of suffering. I am pretty sure that when James finished penning this letter and he slid it across to his editor before it went to the presses, that his editor, that meeting probably didn't go very well. I can imagine his editor picking that up as he slides it across the table, kind of pulling his glasses off and looking. He's like, okay, James, the servant, Jesus, count it all joy, my brother. I can't print this. I can't. How am I supposed to do this? James, nobody's going to read your letter. They're going to be 2 verses in, and they're going to read that statement, that comment, like, consider it all joy when you face trials. And they're like, nope, not for me. I'm not reading any further. I'm done. James, you've barely even said hello, and you're telling them how to think, and you've not even made an argument to them to tell them why this is true. You could have at least built up an argument like, since this is true, and this is true, and this is true, therefore you should consider it joy when you face all these various trials. You've not done that. You've simply made an assertion, do this, a command, do this. James, nobody's ever going to read your letter. It sounds crazy. People are going to be turned off. James has, honestly, a lot of explaining to do, and unfortunately, because of that, so do I. When somebody designs a new garment, there's a lot of thought that goes into the choices of materials that goes into that garment, because you understand that not every fabric is an ideal choice for every item or article of clothing. If it's something like a blanket that's supposed to be warm, soft, and cuddly, you're not going to make that out of like Carhartt material. You understand that if something needs to be fire resistant, you're not going to make that out of like polyester. If something needs to be kind of tough and durable, you don't necessarily make that out of something like a cotton or something that's thin and shreds easily. There's a lot of choices and decision making that goes into that garment. And once in a while you see something that like it doesn't make sense. It like looks nice on the hanger, and then you go to pick it up and you realize how you're going to use it, and like, this is never going to hold up because it's probably just cheap. They were after a certain look, but you start realizing there's no durability built into this garment. It's just to be cheap. But when a garment is purpose-built and constructed, you realize there's a lot of thought that goes into the material of that because they know how it's going to be used and how it needs to hold up. And when God puts the trials and the difficulties in our life, He's doing that same thing. He, as a weaver, so to speak, is weaving together a fabric, weaving together a trial that is custom built and for this specific purpose because there's an intention and an intentionality that's going on behind the scenes. And so the trials that we experience are designed to do something in us. And that's why He says, at least in part, that we can rejoice in this. So as James goes on here, he says, count it all joy. The most important part of this whole thing is how we think about our trials in life. That's the mentality. He says, consider it all, count it all joy. Think like this. It's not normal. It's not natural to think like this. It's the total opposite of that he's asking us to do this morning. And then we understand that mentalities can play a big role in how we perform under pressure. Like when you go into a game situation or you go into some other kind of thing, like your mentality of how you approach it really can make a big difference. We can appreciate that at James because he's telling us, have this mentality, think about it like this. I can appreciate that. But then he keeps going and says, but in a joyful manner. That's the mentality I want you to have. And you're like, that doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand what you mean by this, because his approach is one of joy. It's important to understand that James is not telling us how to feel. He's telling us how to think. He wants to adopt this particular perspective about this occasion that we are in, not the event that we are in. It helps a little bit when you look at the word all. Consider it all joy. What does that all refer to? What is he talking about there? And it's easy for me, at least, when I look at this and I think, well, he's talking about all, like count it all, as in all trials, joy. That's not actually what it's doing there. The all is talking about the joy there. Some translations talk about count it all true joy, or sometimes pure joy. It's kind of this intense joy that we're supposed to be having here, but he's not necessarily talking about the trials. So that's helpful there. He's talking about the kind of joy that we're having, and yet he keeps going and talks about the various trials that we face. So it's still kind of all trials as well. But we're supposed to find joy in the trial, or in the occasion. And we have to understand it's not going to be the only emotion that we experience. It's not. In fact, it might be the one emotion we don't experience at all. You know, we've been going through that untangling emotions on Wednesday nights for, in prior couple months, and it's been since, because we're doing this gentle and lowly, but it's pretty normal for us when we go through anything, whether it's something we enjoy or something we hate, that there's a combination of emotions getting kind of poured into us. It's not just joy, but there's also excitement, and there's the fear sometimes kind of plays in that. There's multiple emotions pouring into us at the same time. But we look at this when it comes to trials, and the one emotion we're going to assume is going to be absent: joy. Like that's not there at all. It's not. We might experience like bitterness, anger, frustration, sorrow. Normal. But joy? No. I really appreciate this comment by Craig Blomberg in his commentary. He says, it's okay if how you feel and how you think are totally different. I feel miserable, but I'm trying to rejoice. See, that's the mentality that he's trying to drive home to us, how we think about this. The question of why God allows the righteous to suffer is one that is extremely old, thousands of years. And as I said before, you're not going to find full answers in James. You're not actually going to find full answers really anywhere. In the Bible, your own thinking and reasoning, any kind of a book written by anyone. You're not going to find full answers to all those questions. But what you are finding here in James is a promise that this is not meaningless. And that's actually a theme that we picked up in other places too. Romans 8:28 is a common one. You can turn there. It's probably worthwhile looking, although you probably have it memorized already. But Romans 8:28, probably one of the most common and well-known verses that we know of, and sometimes probably used poorly. Because again, it forces us, we're too quick with it. We don't think through it. And we can honestly be hurtful with it and use it more of a sword than as a crutch. But we understand Romans 8:28 says, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. Now that verse is not saying that we call absolutely everything that happens in life good. Otherwise, we're calling blatant, obvious, sinful acts done against God and against ourselves and against society and everybody else good. They're not. That's why we call it sin. It's a different category. They're not good. And we don't have to call the hurtful things and the painful things that happen to us, the trials and suffering and persecution that we face, we don't have to call them good. That's not what it says. Look at it. That we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good. That means multiple things are getting put in here before something comes out that's good. And I use this illustration with you, but I really want you to be able to recall it when you need it. And it's painfully simple, but it's like baking a cake, like a chocolate cake per se. And we know that you put a lot of ingredients together to make that cake, and the end product, the end result is something that's good. It fills the house with that wonderful smell. But the individual ingredients that go into making that cake, not that great. You think about that. You think about when either you yourself or your kids or wife or whoever is making that cake, and they start pulling the ingredients out on the table and they're setting them there. There's very few of them that you're really willing to kind of lick your finger and try some. You see a measuring cup, a couple tablespoons of oil on the counter. Anybody that's just like, oh, I got to drink that? Right? No? But a bunch of raw eggs. Some of you might be, oh, yeah, I do that all the time. Help, hitting the gym. Maybe. I don't know if they taste, yuck. But you go like, okay, baking powder. Right? They're gross. I can remember as a kid, I barely remember as a kid, probably about 4, maybe 5, in the kitchen with my mom, and she was making something, or I was just going through the cabinets, I'm not sure which, and I came across one of those giant blocks of that baking chocolate. Yeah, you already know where this is going, don't you? And I pull that thing out, and I'm like, it's chocolate. Mom, can I have some? She goes, no, it doesn't taste good. I'm like, Mom, it's chocolate. It's by default tasty. She goes, no, there's no sugar in it. I didn't believe her. And she, thankfully, to teach me a lesson probably, she broke a little piece off, and here, take it. If you've ever, that is like one of the worst substances on earth. I don't know how, if chocolate actually tastes like that without sugar in it, I don't know how we eat it. It was awful. It was absolutely awful to eat that. And that's the one thing you think, that would be, of all things, that would be the best part. It was terrible. You see, all those things going into that cake by themselves, for the most part, aren't that tasty in and of themselves. A few things like milk and sugar, okay, that we can work with that. But most of the stuff going in there is awful. It's not until it gets mixed together, put in the oven, and baked that something good comes out of it. All things working together become something good. And in life and in the trials that we face, we don't have to call that person and then what they've done to me, we don't have to call that a good thing. But what comes out of it, as God mixes that event plus a whole lot of other things together, can become something good. That's what Romans 8:28 is saying. You can still call that sin. There's consequences. They can go to jail or whatever it happens to be. That's the right thing to do. But what comes out of it, God can use in your life for good. And it's not the only verse to say so. 2 Corinthians 4:17 is another one I've not maybe referenced as often. I probably don't have it necessarily memorized as well, but it says this. Paul is talking, he says, for this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Now, if you look at that passage, you look up just a handful of verses earlier, you start to realize some of the things that Paul is talking about as getting in the category of light, momentary afflictions. And they're not what any of us would define normally as light, momentary afflictions. They're terrible things. Some of the things that Paul has experienced in life. They're only in light because something else is, in comparison, heavier and more and greater, significant. And in that verse, you start looking at that, you realize he's comparing light versus weight, momentary versus eternal, affliction versus glory. There's all these contrasts that are going back and forth in that verse, and he's saying much the same thing, that the things that we face in life, that they're doing something in us, they're not meaningless, Because he says it's preparing for us. These light, momentary afflictions are preparing something for us that is eternal. It's weighty, it's significant, and beyond all comparison. So what you're going through is not meaningless. Your suffering is actually doing something in your life. And therefore we get back to James. He says, consider it all joy then, that God is taking the time to do something in your life. You don't rejoice in the circumstance itself, like the event, but the fact that God is doing something in your life because of it. I think exercise might be a great example of that. I don't think anybody actually likes to exercise in and of itself. I hope not, anyway. There's always one. But the reality is, like, you go to the gym, you get hot, you get sweaty, you stink, and make a mess of everything else like that. Your hair's all wonky now, and you do okay, I exercised. Great, good for you. Why did you do it? Because you just like to get hot and sweaty? Probably not. Why do you do it? Because you like the way it makes you look in the mirror, right? Or your doctor told you need to lower your cholesterol. It's a means to an end. Like, there's all these kinds of things. Like, I need to get stronger so I stop hurting myself. I need to get stronger so I'm working on a certain set of skills, and I need to be stronger in either to do them consistently and to do them well. See, exercise becomes a means to an end. You're trying to do something. The hard part is that when we're going through these kinds of things like this, like trials, because that's kind of like exercise for us, there's not this mirror that we can just look into and okay, I went through this trial, I went through this event, and now I look at myself in my spiritual mirror, I was like, oh, look, a little thinner than I used to be. You can see the results. It's hard to see that. Even before the trial's over, it's like I can't see it. I don't notice what's going on. But the people around you often do. And you might too if you stop and think about it. Think, wait, you know what? I'm not the same person that I was. Something has changed. I'm more patient with people than I used to be. I'm more gracious, loving, giving, relatable, trusting, empathetic. Why? Because I think that's what God was with me when I was suffering. Oh, that's what people were with me when I was suffering, and I realized how self-centered I really was, or unloving I really was, or me-focused that I really was, or just fill in the blank. That's why you can rejoice, and why it's your perspective that James is saying to have joy in, not your circumstances. He goes on here to talk about these kinds, the latter part of verse 2. When you meet trials of various kinds. We know trials and suffering come in all shapes and sizes. We understand that. Religious persecution for James is certainly one of the things that are on his radar, but it's not the only thing. James is going to spend a lot of time talking about money. He's actually going to talk a lot about injustice and health. Really all kinds of things. And what that helps us understand is that when James talks about these various trials, he's being very broad in that. That it's not just a religious persecution that you can say, okay, I should have joy in my religious persecution like the disciples did because I'm suffering for Jesus. Oh, that's true. But so is maybe failing health or a financial struggle. That counts too. God says, I want you to have joy even in that. Now, there is one exclusion. There is one exclusion I think we have to be aware of here that even though James isn't necessarily specific here, I think we need to be, because there's a danger if we're not. That certain things that might happen to you, that if you bring them upon yourself, are not what James is thinking. And by that I mean this, simply that as we go through life, sometimes we go through and we do sin, and there are consequences for that sin, and they can be sometimes staggering. Like, man, this is a heavy trial. God is growing me through this consequence for my sin. That's actually not true. Now, it's not to say that long-term God might not still do something with that, but when we're going through the consequences of our sin are not because God is necessarily trying to grow us. He's trying to drive you back in repentance for what you have done, restore you But that's something you've brought upon yourself, and it's a punishment. It's supposed to be painful and bitter so that you don't do it again, and you're learning from that. But we actually want to disassociate ourselves from sin and the trials and sufferings that James is talking about here, and the reason is actually very easy. Because we get confused. And so you can remember, I think it's John chapter 9, where Jesus and the disciples come up on the man born blind. You know the story? I think John 9, I think that's the only thing in that chapter, if memory serves. But they get there, and the disciples see this man, and they ask this very important question. Who sinned, this man or his parents? Remember the story? And Jesus says, well, like, none of the above. This man was born blind so that the glory of the Son can be manifest, or something like that. It was none of those reasons. It wasn't a result of sin. And so every time something happens to us, we can't default into a strategy of, I must have done something, therefore God is punishing me. You also can adopt the mentality of Job's three friends. Remember, they go in there and Job is suffering terribly. And what is their accusation? You did something. Job's like, I didn't do anything. No. You must have done something, because these kinds of things don't happen to people that don't sin. You did something. And they're making accusations against him. We don't want to do that. Because the problem is, if you start associating those things together all the time, this is what starts to happen in your life. You start thinking like, okay, God is punishing me. For what? I have no idea. How are you going to repent? How are you not going to do it again? How are you going to turn over and make it right? You can't do any of those things. We instinctively know this as parents. When your kids are little, you bring them aside and they're like lying to you, and you're explaining to them, you didn't tell me the truth. You lied to me. You said you did something and you didn't, and then we bring in the punishment. Okay, go to your room, or this is going to happen. Go to mommy's room. We're up a level here. And all these things are unfolding, and we're communicating to something. You did something wrong. This is the punishment for that. But it's clear as day. They can make the connection. But they simply grab your kid and punish them, and they're like, what did I do? And you don't say them. You don't tell them. And they're like, I don't know what to do here. What do? What do you have? A very angry and bitter child who never knows from one moment to the next what their parent is going to do. That's no way to live. And yet there are so many people in the Christian life who think God is like that. He just likes to punish people, and we have to just start guessing. I must have done something, or God just hates me and I don't know what I did. If you can't automatically just associate a consequence of an action with a trial or a thing that you're going through, it's probably not a consequence of sin. It probably is just a trial. Something God has brought in your life, not because of something you have done at all. And it's important we disassociate those ideas together, or we get ourselves in trouble and maybe become very angry and bitter at God because we've misunderstood. Now, verses 3 and 4, and I know you're probably starting to look at your watch and go, you've got to be kidding me. We'll be fast. But we're not just considering the fabric of suffering. But we also want to notice there's a pattern in suffering that God is following here as well. Let's read verses 3 and 4 again. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Seeing the pattern. You know, a pattern can tell you a lot about a piece of clothing. Sometimes it's just the way that it's designed, so it's decoration, but sometimes there's specific reasons why things are the way that they are, and you can start to pick up on a pattern, a theme that's going on through that. And the same is true here. There's a pattern developing that when we go through suffering, we should expect to see the same kind of thing developing in our lives and what we're going through. And it's not going to instruct you like, where am I in the process? It's just what you can expect. When I go through this, then God is working on me to make me more complete. This is the pattern that we should see. And the pattern here it's much the same in verse 3, because it starts out, he says, the testing of your faith. And that's what it's doing. It's testing your faith. It's testing something that is already in existence. You don't test what is simply growing. You test what is existing. It's there. And he says that testing produces steadfastness. It's doing that. And that testing, as he talks about this testing, that was actually a process that we're more familiar with what we would call smelting. And so it's to taking that metals, typically gold or silver, and putting them in a crucible and adding a lot of heat and letting them come to a melting point. And then whoever was working with that, whether it was a goldsmith or a silversmith or just a hobbyist or whatever, but they would get hot and they'd start skimming off all the junk that had risen to the top because the impurities rise to the top. And they make a more pure form of that metal. That's the process of testing or smelting that was going on here. And really what he's saying is here, this testing process, it's a purification process. He's burning off the junk, so to speak, that's on our lives that would have remained if we had not gone through this test, this trial. And what it ultimately does is it makes us more valuable, more pure in the process. But you can imagine anything with that much heat is going to be painful. It's going to hurt. But he says it's doing something in you because it's bringing up to you steadfastness. And that's another word that James uses that has a lot of picturesque meaning behind it. To steadfastness has this idea of like bearing up. It's like picking up a heavy burden and being able to carry it for a long period of time and maybe over a great distance. And what happens? Because it's probably something that's maybe really almost too heavy to pick up and do that with, and yet you're forced to carry it, forced to get it from point A to point B. And in the process, what happens? Those muscles that you're carrying with, they begin to tear, and as they tear and they begin to heal, they get stronger, they get better, they're able to do more. And that's the point. You're bearing up under, you're persevering, enduring through this. You're getting stronger. Your trial is not meaningless. And I think this is a great word for here because it's one of those things that you have to carry a great distance and you can actually put down. And trials are like that. I think trials would feel so much easier if you're like, I don't really like this, but I can pick this up for a while, carry it around, set it down on the shelf, take a breather and pick it back up again. But, trials, they're not that easy. And they're not that simple or straightforward. They're one of those things that we carry. And it's like, I want to put this down, but we can't. And we wind up carrying them. And everybody's trial is a little bit different, but maybe it's weeks, maybe it's years. Lord, why can't I put this thing down? Why won't you end this trial? Because it's building steadfastness in you. And I have a plan. And I know it's hard. But it's doing something in you. It's not meaningless. It's accomplishing something. I think that's why Pastor Love liked this quote from FDR so much. That good sailors are not made on calm seas. Solid Christians are not made from lives of ease and comfort. It is, of course, what we all want. It's just not what we get. And so it's hard. And yet we're called to endure. The next part of this pattern after steadfastness is that it has its full effect. And he says that you might be perfect, complete, and lacking in nothing. That's the full effect of going through it. And those three concepts, three words, perfect, complete, and lacking nothing, are all very much related. But Jesus had actually used that word perfect before. And it's actually the same word. It's teleos. It's the end. It's the perfection that he's talking about here with the disciples when he gives them an impossible standard. I mean, think about this. This is Matthew 5:48. You, Jesus is talking to them. He says, you therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. You realize that God is holy and upright. And that's the standard that Jesus is telling the disciples that they have to meet. How? How do you do that? It's not going to happen. Not this side of eternity, anyway. And Doug Moo, in his commentary, talks about this. He says it's one of those things that just because we can't do it doesn't mean we get to lower the bar. The standard is the standard. And you shoot for that and you aim for that, even though you know I will never get there, but to get closer. We should be on that upward trajectory as we get closer and closer to our own eternity when we will be there because God will make us what we ought to be. But we're not there yet. But that's the standard. That's what we're aiming for and getting closer towards. But that's what Jesus tells the disciples, and that's the word that's being used here. And he goes on for complete, something that's whole, solid, not sick. He says having these things in your life means that you have all the Christian virtues that you're supposed to have. But it comes through suffering. It comes through trial. But that's what makes you, or keeps you from lacking anything that you need It builds something up. You know, the fact that James just gets into this right away is what many people believe. They read this and they think, you know what, like this is the reason that James picked up his pen to start writing. I mean, he just gets in this one verse greeting and immediately he's off and writing right here to this group. And he's trying to encourage them to help them make sense of their situation and what's going on. And he's telling them something. But it is hard to hear. And I think it's hard for all of us to hear too, because it feels like salt in a wound. And you're like, where's the compassion? Where's all the other things we would love to hear about going on here? And James is telling us to be joyful. Because it's only then that you can see your trial as having a higher purpose, not just the pain. And that's what James wants us to help us to see. And it causes us, really forces us to lean in and trust God and to know that I realize, Lord, that this trial is not meaningless. I don't know what you're going to do with it. I don't even know what the meaning is at this point in time. That's okay. But to know that God is doing something and will produce in you something that is needed. And thankfully, trials do have a way of doing something to us. They're kind of like a dividing line. And I forget who, I heard somebody say this many, many years ago, but when you face suffering or trials, always one of two things happen. You either run towards God or you run away from Him. You either lean in towards Him or lean away from Him. But everybody always moves. We never stay the same. We never stay the same. We start moving towards God or away from God. We either start drawing near to Him and trusting Him and saying, Lord, help me do this. Help me get through this because I have no idea how I'm going to do the next 15 minutes, let alone life. Or they run away and said, Lord, if this is who you are, I want nothing to do with you. I've seen both. And you probably have too. And we were just to leave it to ourselves, we would just inevitably fail. But you still might be thinking, I understand what James is telling me to do, but how? How do I do this? And it's not by our own strength. You cannot just willpower your way to think like this. It's not by your own strength. We didn't know how, and James is actually going to share that with us next week. So the important part to understand here is what? What is he telling us to do? He's telling us to have joy in our trials. Joy in what he's accomplishing in us. And next week, he gets into the how. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day that you've graciously given to us to be able to consider again your word. But Lord, you have given us a seemingly impossible task this morning. And Lord, even as I look around this room, I realize there are people that are hearing this that are just probably more hurt by these words. Lord, I hope I haven't added to that hurt. That's certainly not been my goal. But James's words are hurtful enough, and they're hard to understand. How are we to do this? How are we to think through this? Lord, I pray for a strength to endure that defies human logic and reasoning and even source. That you would help us to bear up under our trials, Lord. Help us to be steadfast in these things and persevere through them, even as we seek to try to have this joy that seems so intangible. And to try to have this and realize, Lord, I am glad, Lord, that you're using this and doing something in me, even though I feel like that has got to be the most illogical and impossible reality right now. And Lord, I pray for each and every one of the families that I'm thinking of right now, and probably even beyond, but specifically those families who I know have been impacted by something that they did not ask for, that they did not do anything to deserve, and yet it is there before them, and there's nothing they can do. Lord, I pray you would pull them close. Walk through this valley with them, encouraging and strengthening them. And to at the very least understand and know that this is not some kind of random happening to them, but that you are here with them, growing and making them into something good. So we thank you for your word. In Christ's name, amen. I don't think Pastor Daniel got the memo. Tiffany, can you